Hey folks, I'm Will Brantley, editor of Realtree.com. You see a lot of articles about how to make your venison taste better, new recipes, things like that. Today we're going to talk about all the things that you shouldn't do to your venison from the time you pull the trigger to the time you serve it on the table. We're going to get into 12 reasons why your venison tastes like it. The number one reason why folks end up with venison that doesn't taste good on the table, venison that tastes like hell, is honestly poor field care. And if you ever notice the difference in the way that a commercial butcher would care for beef compared to the way a lot of folks care for their deer, you can see a difference right off the bat. Folks don't field dress it fast enough. They leave it in the sun too long. They haul it around in a four-wheeler in the bed of a truck. They're showing it off. When that animal hits the ground, the process of decomposition starts almost immediately. You've got bacteria in the body. You need to get the guts out of that deer as quickly as you can. You need to get the hide off of it. You need to get the meat off the bone, and you need to get it chilled. The reality is in a lot of the country, deer seasons happen. A lot of deer hunting happens, especially early archery season happens when it's warm outside. And when those temperatures are high, really anything above 50, 60 degrees, you're kind of working against the clock as soon as you pull the trigger. So everybody wants to get their photos. Everybody wants to show their deer off, but you got to remember while you're out there, the most important thing is to take care of that meat and get it chilled as quickly as possible. So poor field care, I would say, is the number one reason why venison ends up not tasting as good as it could. So kind of going hand in hand with that is failure to get it cooled quickly. And I did talk about this a little bit, but just to kind of add on to that, when you go out, especially in the early bow season, I never go out there and get in the stand with a plan of not shooting a deer. You always have to be prepared for that. You got a big job ahead of you. Even if you shoot a doe right before dark, you've got several hours of work, and so you need to plan ahead on that. There are processors that might have a walk-in cooler that they'll let you use, but at minimum, you need to either have a cooler full of ice. A lot of folks like to take big milk jugs full of water, freeze them, and be able to stuff them up in a deer's chest cavity. Me personally, I like to get a deer quartered out, usually in the field, but maybe at home depending on where I'm at. And I'll either get it into I actually keep an old refrigerator in my shop with all the shelves and stuff taken out of it. It's a place where I'll put my deer meat to let it cool overnight. But the important thing is get that temperature down quickly, get that meat away from the guts, and get it cooling fast. So the third reason that that deer meat doesn't always taste as good as it should is honestly, some of us are shooting the wrong deer. Now, I hunt in Kentucky. I live in Kentucky. I'm an outfitter in Kentucky, and we get one buck tag there. And so I'm not running out and shooting the first little buck that I see. That's not what I'm advocating here. But if you're the type who only shoots one old buck a year, you need to understand that old mature buck, most of them are going to taste just fine, but they're also worn down from the rut. They're worn down from age. And that venison is not going to be as good as the venison from a younger buck. It's just the way it is. So the deer, when I'm really focused on shooting a quote unquote meat deer, so to speak, I'm looking for a grown doe, ideally around cropland, or if you've got a year with a heavy acorn crop, those are some of the best tasting deer. They put a lot of fat on when there's a heavy acorn crop around. But I'm looking for a young doe. Honestly, if I can find it, if I can pick it out, like last year's fawn, the following season, when it's an adult deer but it doesn't have fawns, a grown doe with fawns, those fawns are taking all of her fat reserves, in the milk for their, so that they can grow and be strong. And so those older grown does tend to be pretty tough, pretty stringy. So I'm looking for those young adult does, fattened up in crop country. And those are the ones that I'm really going to try to target to put away our family's venison for the season. They make the best steaks, the best roast, just the same as good marbling on a young cow would do. Failure to age and purge. It's another reason why a lot of deer meat doesn't taste as good as it could. I don't like to. Since I wrote this article originally, I think in 2012, and it's 2023 as we're filming this. I've had a lot of experience and shot a lot of deer over the years. I still live in Kentucky. I still hunt in a warm climate, and so I have changed my perspective on this a bit. But even the way that I do things now is still pretty. The principle is the same. So once upon a time, when I would shoot a deer, I would try to get it in a cooler. I would get it in a cooler on ice. I'd keep the drain plug in that cooler open, and I would keep that cooler on an incline. And the idea was for that ice to melt down over the course of a few days and sort of purge the blood out of that deer meat. And if you don't have the option of a walk-in cooler or a big refrigerator dedicated solely to aging your venison, which I would say probably 80% of deer hunters don't have that option, that's still a really good way to do things. The important thing to remember is, you do need to keep that ice clean. You need to check it all the time, and you've got to keep that drain plug open. And one thing that I see happen a lot is when that venison is down in the cooler and you've got it on an incline, sometimes a ham or a shoulder or a backstrap or whatever will actually slide down against the drain plug, clog it up, and then what you end up with is venison that's kind of marinating in a cooler full of bloody water. You definitely don't want that. It's going to make your venison taste worse. So be sure if you're kind of purging the blood out of it, so to speak, you keep that drain plug open, you keep an eye on it, you keep it in the shade, and you want to let that kind of wash itself over the course of a couple of days. And now, me personally, I actually prefer to dry age my venison, and both of these steps are just a way to age your venison. It lets the fibers of the meat break down a little bit. It's more tender over the long run. It's a little bit easier to cut up and to deal with. But I have come to prefer to dry age my meat whenever I've got the opportunity. Now, to do that, you need a clean workstation. You need to be able to keep it, keep your meat clean of hair and dirt and all that stuff. And if it's late season or late gun season, you got a good cool weather, you can hang it up in a shop and let it good cool dry weather age it. But again, like in Kentucky where I live and really in a lot of places these days, it's hard to do that. If it's much over 50 degrees, if it's humid outside, you're kind of running a risk of some spoilage. So you want to find a place like a walk-in cooler. I would prefer to get the hide off of that deer. Some folks like to let a deer hang, so to speak, to age for a few days. I want to get it skinned and taken care of as soon as possible, get that meat cooled down, and then I might let those quarters hang for a few days or let them sit in a refrigerator for a few days. And what you'll get at the end of that, you kind of get a dried crust, actually, that's like over the outside of that meat. And, we're going to get into trimming here in just a little bit, but whenever I get ready to trim my deer meat, actually, if you've ever sliced into like a good country ham, you'll notice that there's that crust on the outside where it's been smoked and where it's been aged. On the inside, it's that nice pink color, and that's what you're looking for with good dry aged venison. You're going to cut that outer shell, that sinew and silver skin and stuff away. As you start to take your muscle groups out from a ham, you're going to see that venison on the inside has really dry aged and gotten a nice color to it. And to me, like that's some of the finest eating venison there is, especially the backstrap steaks when you slice them off there. So failure to age properly, and whether that means dry aging or purging in a cooler, definitely a mistake folks make. So tip number 5, I would say dirty knives, power saws, all those things. So with 90% of the big game butchering work that I do, I'm using just a little scalpel blade knife like this one. This one's I think it's a Hogue. And as I'm talking about dirty knives, you can see this one's actually kind of nasty. I have been using it. But the good thing about those is you can replace the blades on them quickly. They're easy to wash. I use Havalons at times, Outdoor Edge. I don't have a knife brand loyalty. But the point is, a lot of folks think that your deer knife needs to be a great big Bowie knife that's on your belt, and that's not the case at all. And beyond that yet, a lot of folks think that you can't take a deer apart without power saws and bone saws and all those things. And I've seen a lot of deer clean like that. And if you will take just a little time to learn the anatomy of a deer and where the ball and socket joints put everything together, you can take an entire deer apart with a little bitty knife just like that with just one blade. You don't really need much of anything else, and it's cleaner. You don't have saws throwing bone fragments out into the meat, and it's just a cleaner job of processing the whole thing. And I've processed a lot of whitetails with a little knife of that size, and I've processed elk and bull moose. So the point is to have a good, sharp, clean blade, and I like the little replaceable blades because you can replace them. You can keep those blades clean, and be sure that when you switch from, say, gutting an animal to skinning an animal, you're changing out a new blade. You don't want to start cutting meat with the same blade that you use to cut the tarsal glands off of a buck or something like that. So just being cognizant of that and being clean as you work is a really good way to be sure that your venison is going to taste fresh and it's going to be clean as well. So tip number 6 is poor trimming, and this is something that that I see with a lot of new deer hunters in particular, and sometimes I even see it with deer processors. You take a deer in, you want to get steaks done, and they take a whole deer ham and put it in a meat saw and cut big old steaks off of it, just like you would cut off a beef steak. And the problem with that, like it looks pretty good. There might even be the nice little round ham bone in the middle, but the fat and the sinew and the silver skin on a deer, all the connective tissue that keeps those muscles together, it doesn't taste as good on a deer as it does on a cow. Honestly, it doesn't taste as good on a deer as it does an elk or a moose. I don't really know why that is, and maybe your personal taste preferences are different than mine, but for me and most people that I know who actually eat a whole lot of deer meat, a whole lot of venison, proper trimming is of the utmost importance, and that's especially true for your steaks. Your backstrap steaks, anything that you're rendering out of the sirloin muscles of the hams, anything that you're going to grill, fry, kind of eat just for the taste of venison. You need to be sure to trim the edges of it really well. Trim away all the fat, silver skin, anything that's not pure lean muscle meat. I like to trim that away, and it's not that it needs to go to waste. A lot of that stuff, a lot of that trim, can go into a pot. It makes pretty good stew meat. It's one of those things that you can slow cook it and you can cook it down, and it within reason. It doesn't need to be just a big chunk of fat in there, but some of the trimmed muscle pieces and things, it does cook down and make pretty good stew meat, and even some of just the dedicated scrap. My dog loves it. It makes good cheap dog food, and it's really good for them. So that's kind of the way to. A lot of folks, when they're really trimming venison and they see somebody who's really particular about trimming their venison like I am, they think, oh man, you're wasting a lot of it. And actually no, the finished product that we're left with is something that they're going to clean their plate. So that's definitely not going to waste. And then that trim is getting used for something else too. So reason number 7, and this is a deer burger tip. I would say a lot of venison is eaten and certainly a lot of the venison that we eat in a year's time is eaten in hamburgers, in chili, in tacos, sloppy joes. We call them sloppy doughs. A lot of the day-to-day recipes, if you will just make it a point of substituting ground beef for ground venison, you can go through a whole lot of deer meat. You'd be surprised how many deer you can go through in a year just by doing that, and it's really good. It's so good, in fact, that to this day, if we happen to run out of ground venison or haven't thawed any out, and maybe we pick up a pound of ground beef at the store, when I make chili or spaghetti or something out of that ground beef, it almost feels like I've been drinking cough syrup, like the back of my throat is coated with the fat from eating that, just because we're so used to eating that lean venison. So I've got a reason here. It says lean burger, and it seems a little bit counter to what I just talked about poor trimming. But venison, because venison is so lean, it doesn't want to hold together. The ground venison doesn't always want to hold together when actually patted into a hamburger patty. And you'll see a lot of folks that will, cook a deer burger on the grill, and they eat it, and it's dry and it's crumbly and it's just not juicy the way that you want a good cheeseburger to be. And that is actually where you need to get rid of the deer fat still. You need to trim your meat properly that you're going to ground, but you also need to introduce some fat of some sort in there. For actually making cheeseburger patties, hamburger patties, I like to take a little cheap bacon, like go to the dollar store and get the cheapest, fattiest bacon that you can find, the stuff that would shrivel up into a little bitty crackling whenever you're frying it. That's the stuff you can take just a little bit of that and cut it into your ground deer meat, and it makes those burgers stick together. It gives you a little bit of a bacon flavor. It's really good. Now, that bacon flavor can be a little bit overpowering, especially when you start getting into your sloppy joes, your tacos, your chilies, things like that. And so in that case, particularly if I'm hired a processor, I'll have them cut my venison with just a little beef fat or even a little pork fat. Either one of those does a pretty good job. It doesn't have to be real heavy. It can, and your processor's probably going to ask you, what do you want, 10%, 20%? And so a lot of the times, actually, whenever I'm going to have a deer ground, I will have a portion of it ground with some sort of fat, maybe a little bit heavier pork fat or bacon to make hamburgers, and then I might have some stuff just straight ground, and and I'll set that aside. It'll be in a different packaging or different labeling or whatever, and that straight ground is what I'll use again for my chili, spaghetti, tacos, things like that. But that little bit of fat can make all the difference in the world. If you're cooking deer burgers on at a barbecue, that's going to make it taste a lot better. Okay, so reason number 8, cut rate processors. Now, I know there's probably some venison processors out there who may have even listened to some of these tips that I've said and disagrees with them and says, I cut up deer meat for a living, and this guy's blaming processors. So I'm not doing that. I have some good buddies who are processors, and I'm definitely not trying to pick on them. But the fact is, most deer that are shot end up at a processor, and a lot of folks don't have the time or the knowledge to process it themselves at home, and certainly nothing wrong with taking it to a good processor. The problem is that some processors are kind of high volume folks, and I go back to one of the first deer that I ever took to a processor myself. We always grew up, taking care of our own deer meat at home, but I took a deer to a processor down in Tennessee. I walked in, I wanted to have some burger and some summer sausage done, and I'm pretty particular. You think about all the tips that we've talked about previous to now. I'm pretty particular about getting my deer back and all the steps that I take to be sure I get my deer back. So anyway, I took this boned out deer in a cooler. This processor weighed it, told me what it weighed. I told him what I wanted done. He goes to the back room. He comes out with the equivalent in ground burger and summer sausage and says, here you go. And so he basically just had a big bin that he was throwing everybody's deer meat in and making the products. And, it wasn't that good, and that's just not my thing. I have no idea what somebody else has done or hasn't done to care for their deer before they take it to a processor. So if you're going to use a processor, I would say talk to them before gun season comes in. Get an idea of what their workflow is like, what their volume is, and how many folks they have working with them. And just be insistent that, hey, if I'm going to bring you my deer and pay you my money, I want my deer and my money back. So otherwise, you can run into a situation like I ran into, and a lot of times that finished product is not all that good. Reason number 9, too much marinade. Now, I like lots of seasoning on just about any grilled meat that I eat. In particular, I like my batter for fried fish and fried backstrap all seasoned heavily. I'm not really talking about seasoning so much as I'm talking about the marinades that a lot of folks put on their meat prior to putting it on the grill or frying it or whatever they're going to do. I grew up, we ate a lot of deer meat marinated in Italian dressing, and Italian dressing is fine, but when you marinate a little bitty piece of backstrap overnight in Italian dressing, it's going to taste like Italian dressing. And the same goes for barbecue sauce or any one of a dozen other marinades that folks soak their deer meat in. And barbecue sauce and Italian dressing taste just fine, but venison itself tastes really good. And so I do like some marinades, but I like them to be kind of on the light side. Like me personally, I like a little olive oil. I like some minced garlic, a little salt and pepper. And I don't marinate it for very long, just enough to get it kind of worked into the meat a little bit, and then I'm going to cook it pretty quick. So if you're going to use marinades, be kind of picky on them. Don't pick something that's overpowering, and definitely don't soak your meat for overnight or 2 or 3 days. Another cooking tip, reason number 10, you're cooking your deer meat too cool for too long. Now, there are kind of 2 extremes to this. If you have, let's say you want a crock pot of deer roast and you want it to come out fork tender, that is something you're going to want to cook it in a liquid. You're going to want to simmer it for a long time if you're cooking shanks or whatever. The way that you do that is cooking it for a long time in a liquid on low heat, and it'll get fork tender. But for most of the recipes, for my favorite venison recipes, backstrap cooked in a skillet, cooked on a grill, because it is so lean, you need to be thinking really high heat and cooking it really fast. And the idea is you want to almost sear the outside of the deer meat while leaving the inside medium rare. Now, a lot of folks, given cooking tips, will say that they want their deer meat, their duck meat, or whatever to be rare, almost bloody on the inside. I like it fairly rare, but I also like it to be cooked. So for me, that means, again, like that good sear on the outside, You want to lay a piece of backstrap on a hot grill, hot charcoal or gas grill. When you take it up, it ought to have good sear marks on the back. And if it doesn't, if it's just kind of that gray, kind of rubbery, texture, when that meat is done, it's going to taste kind of gray and rubbery and tough and kind of tasteless, and it's not going to be very good. If your backstrap's taken more than about 3 minutes to cook on a grill, you're probably cooking it a little bit too long and on too low a heat. The same thing goes for a skillet, and that's a good cooking tip to remember. I'm gonna switch the order of some of these tips a little bit in the story. This one was actually the last tip, but since we're talking about cooking, I'm gonna move it up to tip number 11, and that's getting too fancy. And there are any number of places where you can go and check out a recipe for cooking venison. I mean, right here on Realtree.com's website, Michael Penley does the Timber to Table blog. He has got all kinds of really good venison recipes out there. But one of the things that I like about Mike's recipes, compared to some of the others on the internet, and not no knock against any of the others, Mike's are recipes that I always feel that I can make myself. Some of the recipes I've seen out there for wild game and the finished prepared course, it looks like something that I feel like I've got to have a coat and tie on to sit down there and eat, and a bunch of different types of silverware that I'm not even sure why I have 3 or 4 different kinds of forks. People tend to get a little bit too fancy, I think, with their venison recipes and make them a little bit too complicated. Mike's recipes, like we talked about it a minute ago, high heat, good seasonings, light marinades. Things are cooked quick, and they're simple, and they're easy to follow. And day in and out, I like fried backstrap in a skillet, battered with seasoned flour, some Ritz crackers maybe crumbled up in a bag. I like it, with a little olive oil, some minced garlic thrown on a grill. And then, my family we eat venison probably 3 nights a week, year round. We go through a lot of deer. And most of it, like I said earlier, is just a substitute for what we would use beef anyway. We cook venison and noodles. We cook tacos and spaghetti and chili and just all, pretty much anything that you can use beef for, you can use venison as a pretty good substitute. You're not going to get a good juicy ribeye out of a deer. They don't have that good marbled fat on there, and I do like a good juicy ribeye every now and then. But for your day-to-day, kind of easy recipes to fix after work, like venison works pretty well. And so I think a lot of folks tend to overthink it. They think they have to have some kind of fancy way to cook it, and that's not it at all. Just take what you've got, cook it the way that you would cook beef, and enjoy it. And I think that's probably one of my favorite tips for making your venison taste better. So that last one is the 12th reason why your venison tastes like hell is not storing it properly. And there are a lot of vacuum sealers and a lot of different things on the market for freezing your deer meat. I've tried a lot of vacuum sealers over the years, and I've actually had few of them that worked well. They'll work to store your meat, in the short term. They're certainly convenient. They're certainly convenient for thawing out, packages of meat and thawing it quickly, and for portioning things. But for long-term storage, like I tend to do with venison, I haven't seen that vacuum sealing works as well as, properly wrapping. We tend to kind of, when we're butchering our meat, we'll cut it up in portions. We'll wrap it with like cellophane wrap, and then we'll wrap it with good butcher paper. We tape it up tight and, try to press that air out of it. And that good freezer paper just seems to do a better job, in my experience anyway, of keeping that venison dry the way that it needs to be and keeping that freezer burn out. And then when you go to thaw it out 6 months later, the finished product just seems better. So however you're doing it, maybe you've got a vacuum sealer that you really like, and if you do, use it if it works for you. I'm certainly not saying that they don't work. I'm just saying what works best for me has always been, good butcher paper and tape and keeping it long term. However you're doing it, you need to keep that freezer burn out of there and keep that meat tasting fresh. And ideally, you finish out all the venison in your freezer in a year's time, make room for the next season. So there you have it. It's 12 reasons why your venison tastes like hell, according to me. So again, I'm not saying that I'm the expert on venison. I'm not a butcher. I'm not a chef. I'm just a guy who cuts up a lot of deer in a year's time and eats a lot of deer in a year's time. So if you have some more to add to it, or you want you might want to challenge one of these ideas. Leave us a comment down below. Just get a conversation going and let's talk about it. So hope you learned something today, and we'll talk to you next time.